thank you all for coming here tonight. My name is Holscher, and I am the University Archivist here at UNM. And I am one of the archivists who is involved in working with the Archdiocese of Santa Fe Abuse Archive here. UNM is the first university in the nation to hold an abuse archive, which is a collection of materials that document Catholic clerical sexual abuse. Tonight we have a panel of experts who will discuss its origins, scope, and significance both for researchers and the public. For those of you who don't know, the Archdiocese of Santa Fe Abuse Collection was created as part of the 2022 settlement agreement between the Archdiocese and the survivors of sexual abuse. The documents include depositions, transcripts, personnel files, meeting minutes, and proofs of claim. And these records are online and available to the public with some redactions to protect the privacy of the claimants and their families. And before I introduce the panelists, I just want to thank our sponsors, the Center for Southwest Research and Special Collections, the UNM Endowed Chair of Roman Catholic Studies, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and the Envision Lab. And also I want to give a special thanks to Marisol Velasquez for filming tonight's event, and to Ann Schultz and Access Services for lending Marisol to the CSWR. Now I'm going to go ahead and introduce my panelists. And here we have Patrick J. Wall, who is a former Catholic priest and Benedictine monk. And today he works as a survivor advocate and is a world-renowned expert on the Catholic clergy abuse crisis. And next is Katie Holscher, who holds the Endowed Chair in Roman Catholic Studies at UNM and is a historian who researches and writes about clerical sexual abuse. Then we have Terry McKiernan, who is the founder and president of bishopaccountability.org, the world's first and largest public library of information on the Catholic clergy abuse crisis. And finally, we have Levi Monagle, who is a partner at the law firm Hall, Monagle & Wallace, and represents survivors of clerical sexual abuse in New Mexico, and he was instrumental in the creation of the UNM archive. So now I'll turn it over to the panel, please.
All right, welcome. This is such a fantastic moment in time. As a person who's been at this since 1991, this is the first major set of documents, I think, that has been organized in such a comprehensive way. And it's also a set of documents, I think, that holds a secret that needs to be studied further, specifically on what happened in the 20th century that made New Mexico such a center of the world in the response to clerical sexual abuse. And I can tell you from my canonical training, my life as a priest, and in working on cases, that one of the major things that has to be present, the Archbishop of Santa Fe has to basically support, sign off, and be able to make this happen. The servants of the Paraclete would never have happened as a pontifical order, just a fancy name for worldwide, is specifically unless the Archbishop of Santa Fe made the decision that something needed to happen in a very organized fashion. The servants of the Paraclete could have popped up in Brooklyn, it could have popped up in St. Paul, in Spokane, wherever. But because the Archbishop of Santa Fe understood and responded in such a powerful way, that needs to really take some focus here. And this is the first time all these documents are really public, that you get to see all this. In addition, not only what was in the priest personnel files, but you get to see in all the depositions, all the fantastic lawyers that have helped train Levi to carry on the tradition, that Bruce Pasternak stands out right away. It's, wow, what a powerful advocate for survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and then going through and making all of this happen. It didn't happen in a day, it didn't happen in a year, it didn't happen in a decade. This takes decades to happen. And so this is, first of all, I would say that number one, this is a monument to the survivors' focus to be able to get this done. It's also a monument to all the other lawyers. I'm thinking Steve Tinkler, there's a whole bunch of people in town that worked really hard their entire legal careers to be able to make this happen, and people that you will never hear of. But it's a source that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And I come from St. John's, you know, a place in Collegeville that has a lot of documents, right, from many, many centuries. And this is a unique collection. The other thing I would want to have you think about and really ponder as you study this and as you think about this is from an archival standpoint. Remember, archive is a Greek word, and then it got brought into Latin, and then it got brought into early French, and then the Normans invaded, and so it got enculturated into English. So the government documents, this is why it's also such a success for survivors. This is now the official record of what really happened. In the past, the record was behind a file cabinet in a closed place that nobody had access to. Now, what happened is now available for anyone to study today, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And that is a gigantic movement forward, because this is one of the largest secrets that was kept in the 20th century. So when you look at archives, many people think, well, you got a bunch of introverted, really smart people that love to work with documents. But I tell you what, this is a living archive. And what we say in archives a lot of times is the past is the prologue to the future. You'll even see that in the National Archives, unless the president decided to scrape it off lately. But the past is the prologue to the future. Now that we know this, now that we're learning this and we're starting to interpret what actually happened and drink it in and feel it, now we can move forward and do things differently. That's how we can now say, the past is not going to be the prologue to the future. The future is going to be different because we actually have this full archive and this full record of what happened. When I think of all of the priest files I have read, when I think of all of the different tiny pieces and fragments, because that's usually what you get in discovery. And Levi can tell you about this. You never get the full story. They never turn it all over. So this is probably the best snapshot that we're probably ever going to get in a comprehensive way. So I would encourage anyone, whatever discipline you come from, to be able to look at this and to say, wow. New Mexico was the center of the response to the secret crisis of childhood sexual assault in the entire world under the Roman Catholic umbrella. This is the place that enveloped and brought everything else out. All the core pieces of the institutional response was here, and everyone, a lot of bad guys from around the world were sent here. There were a lot of church leaders that came here. Millions of dollars were spent on institutional people, but not on survivors. And I'm hoping that as we study this, we can change our spirituality, we can change our future by understanding the basic principles that are in these documents. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that I am an eternal optimist when it comes to change. And these things will change, but we're going to have to buckle down and really study them. If they just sit online and no one looks at them, then nothing's going to happen. What needs to be done is serious study, serious awareness, and I'm going to do my part like I started doing at the National Crime Victims Bar Association a few weeks ago, and letting others know that these documents do exist and they're going to continue to grow. And one of the powerful things, and I'll say lastly, that you all should be very proud of, is that the way to handle these future disclosures and all of these documents is the first response is here, and the first really thoughtful response of how to put these documents is here. But for a couple of really cool people, the rest of the world will never have access to these, and I want to say thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, okay. I do not know how to give a homily, so I wrote I wrote everything down.
Good professor.
Okay, so I study Catholic, U.S. Catholic history, and so today I want to think about how the arrival of abuse archives like the one here at UNM are impacting already and are going to continue to impact how we study the Catholic past. So I want to begin by offering a very short, broad brushstroke account of the history of the study of Catholic history. This is what historians call historiography, because I want to offer a sense of how the types of archives that scholars have available to them have always shaped the stories they tell about the Catholic past. And then I'll end by offering a few observations that can hopefully help us think about what abuse archives bring that's new to the study of Catholic history. So for the purpose of this conversation, I want to divide the study of Catholic history in the US into 3 phases. For the first phase, I'm going to go back quickly, a bit more than a century, to 1919. That was the year that an organization called the American Catholic Historical Association was founded. It's an organization that I'm still involved in more than 100 years later. For the first 60 years of the ACHA's existence and my story of Catholic history in the US, this is what I'm going to call the first phase. Almost all the historians who made up this field of study, at least professionally, were men of European descent, and many of them were actually themselves Catholic priests. The founder of the ACHA, for example, was a priest named Peter Gilday. He was a professor at a Catholic institution of higher ed, and to give you a sense of the kind of work these men did, he wrote a biography. Those of you who are in my class this semester, he wrote a biography of John Carroll, the first US bishop, right? So during the 20th century, Catholic history grew into this really big academic field. Today, the ACHA has several hundred members. And part of the reason it became so big is because Catholic colleges and universities kept hiring faculty who studied the Catholic past, because it was a way of boosting their Catholic identities. And part of the reason it became big also has to do with archives. Catholic institutions keep an enormous number of records. Then, as now, there are hundreds of Catholic institutions in this country, dioceses all over the place, religious orders, other institutions, and almost all of them have collected and preserved boxes upon boxes, shelves upon shelves, rooms upon rooms of materials documenting their own past. And that includes the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, which has its own archive, its own institutional archive, up in Santa Fe, right around the corner from the cathedral. So as a rule of thumb, Catholic institutions hold on to paper, and they actually have to do this. Canon law, or the rules of the church, require them to hold on to paper. So back in the 20th century, if you were a graduate student in history looking for materials to support a dissertation, Catholic institutions could be great places to go. But there was, like there still is, a catch. Catholic institutions are private, and they are very cautious about who they let in and what they let people see when they visit institutional archives. The tendency of the institutional Catholic archive to be restrictive also has a basis in church law, which says, quote, "No one's permitted to enter except with the permission of the bishop or his chancellor." So when a researcher visiting an archive was himself a priest, as many early historians of US Catholicism were, he might be allowed to see a lot. But if he or she was a lay person, getting access to documents could be a lot trickier. So these factors, the kind of people who study Catholic history, plus the archival materials available to them, shaped the first phase of US Catholic historiography. The scholars who studied the Catholic past during that period were almost all Catholic, and generally they wrote accounts that put American Catholicism in a really positive light. They tended to focus on Catholic leaders, especially bishops and priests, who built institutions, who overcame hardships, and who contributed to American intellectual and political history. Those are the themes that really dominated the first 60 years of Catholic historiography in this country. And generally speaking, Catholic institutions like dioceses had loads of records they were willing to share when it came to telling those kinds of stories, because those are the kinds of stories that put institutions in a positive light. So now phase two. What I'm going to call the second phase of Catholic history dates to later in the 20th century. That phase was marked by new stories about the past, ones that began to focus on lay or ordinary Catholics rather than institutions and clergy. And that focus on ordinary people demanded a turn away from institutional archives. So back in 1985, there were two important books that were published the very same year. In the first, a former Catholic priest, a guy named J. Dolan, published a social history of US Catholicism. US Catholic history, he wrote, needs a, quote, focus on the people and not just the prelates. A prelate is a bishop, right? Not just the prelates. On the experience of religion and not just the institutions. And the same year, a young historian named Robert Orsi published a book called The Madonna of 115th Street. The Madonna was a study of, quote, religion in the streets. Orsi wanted to understand devotion to the Virgin Mary among Italians in New York City, quote, in the way the people themselves discuss it. And so in his approach, institutional Catholicism receded to a background concern. It only mattered insofar as it impacted the day-to-day lives of ordinary men and women. And Orsi, although he is a Catholic, was trained not at a Catholic institution of higher ed, he was trained at Yale University, at a non-Catholic institution, and I think that actually matters. And he left institutional archives behind when he did the research for that book. Instead, he turned to interviews, right? He went out and he read and interviewed, he read interviews by and he interviewed himself lay Catholics, right? And those Catholics often did things when priests weren't looking, and he wanted to know about those things. Interviews, he said, quote, allowed me to ask the people themselves about their values and perceptions. The Madonna, that book, had a massive impact on our field. In the decades after its publication, multiple generations of scholars, myself included, signed up to study US Catholic history with a commitment to what we call lived religion. For many of us, that meant telling stories about the Catholic past in which people came first, and priests and bishops and their institutions came second. Some historians continued work in institutional archives and brought new critical lenses for engaging the material that they found there. Ramon, I think your book is a great example of that, right? I mean, you use institutional archives in that book. 1992, right? So the 90s. But other of us during this second phase included other methods. We looked to other methods like ethnography, oral history, legal studies, the study of material culture, to build the stories that we now wanted to tell about the Catholic past. So today, at least for the sake of conversation, I want to propose that abuse archives like UNM's represent an advent of a kind of third phase of the historiography of American Catholicism, or at least maybe one important element in the third phase. Suddenly we're talking a lot about institutions again, institutions and their archives. So if this is true, how does this phase relate to the prior phases of the study of US Catholic history? What sorts of stories about the past do abuse archives now nudge us toward and maybe away from? What can they tell us that's new about Catholicism? What are their limitations? I can't answer these questions today. I wrote this paper and realized I was just asking more and more questions. But I'll offer a couple observations and a few more questions that might nudge us in an interesting direction. First observation. Abuse archives are a mixture of institutional records, a la phase 1, and also lay voices, a la phase 2. And in them, those different types of sources speak really intimately with one another. On one hand, as I said, the abuse archive invites a return to the study of institutional Catholicism, of priests and bishops and the things that they do. Suddenly, we have materials, or at least some of the materials, that the diocesan archives held back, but that bishops and the ones that bishops and chancellors didn't want researchers to see. Earlier generations of historians, a lot of them wouldn't have known about this material, and even if they had known about this material, they probably wouldn't have wanted to use it in their work for complicated reasons. On the other hand, abuse archives also center the voices of survivors. But those voices don't speak to us through freewheeling interviews, at least not oftentimes. And they don't speak to us, at least directly, about religion on the streets. In the UNM archives, survivors will speak to us through proofs of claim they submitted during bankruptcy proceedings, and they will speak to us invariably, again and again and again, about priests. So this isn't just the stuff of institutional history, at least in its old form. nor is it just the stuff of lived religion. So what models of Catholic history will this new assemblage of sources support? Second, to state the obvious, abuse archives organized around one historical problem, clerical sexual abuse, during a relatively narrow historical period, roughly the 1950s through the present. Clearly, this is an enormous problem with enormous consequences. But we know clerical abuse during that time, it wasn't universal to the Catholic priesthood, or at least most priests did not directly commit abuse. And most Catholic laity did not, directly at least, suffer abuse. How will the fact that in New Mexico, we now have thousands of pages of personnel files related to several dozen credibly accused priests, but no similar records for hundreds of other clergy who served in the archdiocese during the same period, how is that going to shape our understanding of the Catholic past here? I'm cognizant, too, of the fact that even this limited selection of personnel files gives us suddenly a lot of information about clergy in a region, New Mexico, where Catholic history, over the last 200 years anyway, has largely been talked about as a thing shaped by the absence of priests, right? I mean, a lot of times we talk about Catholicism here as being shaped by an absence of priests, and now we have an overwhelming priestly voice that has like plunged into the conversation, right? Given how abuse archives are organized, can they be useful to historians who want to tell stories about Catholicism that aren't explicitly stories of sexual abuse? If so, what kind of critical work is required to demonstrate their relevance and to apply them toward other kinds of studies? On a related note, abuse archives are phenomenally accessible to scholars and the public. They're digital, right? Institutional Catholic archives are far less accessible. They place restrictions on access, and most of them are well behind the curve in digitizing materials. You would have a hard time finding a lot of digital archives when it comes to institutional Catholic archives. So what this means is that large numbers of people can now access a Catholic past that features clerical abuse as a prominent feature, and smaller numbers will be able to access other Catholic pasts, namely those supported by the range of documents housed in institutional archives. So, to sum it up, those of us who study Catholic history can no longer do research, whether it's institutional archival research or abuse archival research, without asking questions about archives themselves. Why we're able to access some kinds of materials and not access other kinds of materials, why the archives available to us have the shapes that they do, and how those shapes will inform our knowledge of the past. All of us who use institutional archives today are well aware of the overabundance of certain kinds of materials versus the boxes of restricted documents cut from our view. Those dynamics are necessary stories behind the stories that we tell about the past, whenever we work in those archives. And scholars who will use abuse archives, like the one at UNM, are also going to need to do so with critical awareness of their shape. They tell us so much, suddenly, about the personal lives of priests, or at least some priests. How will this new abundance coax us towards some forms of history of survivors? But how does the language survivors speak in the archive, informed as it is by the questions of attorneys and the general political and cultural moment they speak in when they're narrating their abuse, how does that shape the knowledge of the past they're bringing us? So the Archdiocese of Santa Fe is a remarkable and complicated moment in the history of the study of Catholic history, and I'm excited to see what it brings.
Okay, so my part of this topic is the UNM Clerical Abuse Archive in context. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of it all, but before I do, many, many thanks to Portia and to Avi, Katie, to Kevin, to the supporters of this effort that are listed there. It's really an honor to be here. Now, I know that some people here are experts at the Catholic clergy abuse crisis, but many of you probably aren't. Some of you are probably experts, certainly experts at archives, but many of you aren't. I'm going to try to bring those two topics together and look a little bit at the history through an archival lens. A little bit about me before I get started. This is the organization that I founded back in 2003. It's honestly, by now, an amazing place to go and look at the history of all of this. And the name of our organization, bishopaccountability.org, is also the URL, and you're very, very welcome to visit us. One of the things that you'll find there, the second box there from the left, is a bunch of priest files. 43,000 pages out of 3.5 million pages that we have in our archive. And I gotta say, I think it's an absolutely amazing experience to just dive in and read some of this stuff, because what you learn and what you see is pretty amazing. We're a little organization, that's me wearing the same shirt for some reason, with my colleague Ann Doyle to the left of me. Steve Sheehan is sitting, and the amazing Susie Nauman, who does our database of accused priests, is there at a document we're looking at. So here's the way I'm going to organize this. First, I'm going to talk about the 5 phases that I see the Catholic abuse crisis as having gone through in the United States, just to sort of set the scene for people who hadn't been studying it. Second, I'm going to loop back through those and describe how the archives have evolved during those 5 phases. And I'm going to finish by celebrating, and I think celebrating is the right word for this amazing new archive, and talk about its importance, the connections that it makes, and its example. So first, the 5 phases. It's generally agreed that this whole terrible topic began back in the 4th century, when priests are known to have been abusing children. But for us in the United States, the way it became public was really in 1985 with a case in Louisiana involving a guy named Gilbert Gote, whom you'll meet in a second. The second phase opened at the beginning of the 1990s, involving a priest named James Porter, who offended in Massachusetts, but was sent here to New Mexico to be treated and abused other kids here. This was the phenomenon that Pat was talking about that made this place the true epicenter. You watch the movie Spotlight, which is a great movie. New Mexico isn't even mentioned. New Mexico is super important in this story, and that's what this archive really makes clear. The third phase was in 2002, the Spotlight phase. The fourth phase, I think, happened when Cardinal McCarrick was exposed and ultimately defrocked. And also, an amazing report came out in Pennsylvania that changed the way we look at all of this. And I think it's not crazy to say that Portia and Avi's archive is the 5th phase. And we can talk a little bit about that in a moment. So looping back, how did these archives evolve? So there's Gilbert Gote on the left, and the survivor of his abuse, the late, unfortunately, Scott Gastow, who had the courage to come forward and talk about the abuse he had suffered. He was represented by this very, very formidable Cajun lawyer, Minos Simon, and the story was described by Jason Berry. And it's Jason Berry's work in a local newspaper, in a national Catholic newspaper, and then in 3 books that really is the heart of journalism about the Catholic abuse crisis. But what Jason had to contend with was the Church's secret archive system, which is described here. This is a piece of canon law that talks about a secret archive, how it's locked up, how only one person has a key to it. To crack that was the secret behind beginning to understand how all of this had happened. Jason was able to do that to some extent because people looked on documents. Now, one of the things that he documented was this amazing group of 2 priests and actually Gote's defense lawyer. These guys together wrote a report back in 1985 telling the bishops how terrible this situation was. They were ignored. Tom Doyle was blackballed. He became an expert witness and one of the crucial experts in all of this. Now, for the rest of the 80s, things began to develop. Survivors began to to organize together. The woman on the left, Jean Miller, founded an organization called the Linka. Barbara Blaine on the right in the middle founded an organization called SNAP. And it was survivors beginning to talk with each other and speak with one voice, which provided a lot of the energy in all of this. In 1992, the Linka held a conference, and some of the luminaries there, Tom Doyle there on the left without his beard now and not smiling as much, Jeff Anderson, the key attorney in the early cases, and a lot of the later ones as well. Jean Miller again, you see her. Richard Sight, a former priest who also became an expert witness. Andrew Greeley, who was a popular Catholic author at the time, and Jason Berry again. Now, the guy second from the left, Jeff Anderson, like Jason Berry, was digging into these archives and beginning to understand how the Catholic Church worked. And the ancestor of all of that effort is the archive that we're talking about tonight. Phase 2. James Porter abused well over 100 kids in Fall River, Massachusetts, which is the diocese that includes the town. One of the people that he abused grew up and became an investigator, called Porter up on the phone and was able to record the conversation and played that recording on a TV station in Boston and blew the thing wide open. Porter, it turns out, had been sent here to be treated at the Servants of the Paraclete up the road in Hemel Springs. One of the things that was revealed by this case was that, as Pat said, priests were coming from all over the country to this place. And then when they were treated at the Servants of the Paraclete, they were sent out into the parishes locally where they abused kids again. Many of you know this story. It began to be understood on a national level for the first time in 1992 and the years following. This document, which shows the parishes where they were sent here in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, was a crucial piece of evidence in establishing this. What happened as a result in the 90s was that documents began to appear in newspapers. It was before the internet, of course. You couldn't share files. But you began to see documents. Brooks Edgerton wrote a terrific article about a priest also sent to the Servants of the Paraclete. And this article included excerpts from all of these documents that he was able to find. I've asked him time and again, who leaked these documents to you? And he still won't tell me. Another thing that happened, besides the documents beginning to be available, was that the tech that we needed to share documents began to be developed during the 90s. The PDF was developed. Initially, nobody used it much. The PDF reader became free, and suddenly we could share stuff. And that was absolutely crucial. This gentleman on the left, Jay Nelson, was involved in the link-up and very important in the newsletter that was sent around by the link-up every quarter or so. And it included, on the right there, basically what was a proto-news blog. It was still in print, the internet really didn't exist, but they grabbed pieces of articles about clergy abuse from all over the country and printed them. And this was the way, before the internet, people began to have an internet consciousness of how this thing was local, it was national, it was global. They also had a website, and they began to post stuff, including Santa Fe stuff. So they posted back, I believe, in 1998, the Sanchez deposition that has been posted in a little bit more readable form by Portia and Avi. So this whole operation that the link-up had was an ancestor of what we're celebrating today. The amazing thing is that the guy who did this is here in the audience. And I'm wondering if Jay Nelson could stand up and take a bow. Jeez. There's his book on the servants of the Paraclete, and I highly recommend it. It's a revealing read. Okay, phase 3. Hey. This is the spotlight phase, right? When Paul Shanley and John Gagan were revealed by the Boston Globe. The person on the right in the middle is Greg Ford, whose case was the case that revealed all the documents in Boston. Now they were premiered, the Shanley file, which was the file of the person who had abused him, was revealed by Eric McLeish, the lawyer, at a huge press conference. And the document that he has up on the screen, and Art Austin said to me, they already know. That document showed that Shanley was transferred because of abuse to Arts Parish, where he abused him. I go into a little bit of detail here and spend a little time because I want to convey how important these archives are and how important these documents are. They mattered so much to the gentleman sitting next to me that he started weeping beside me because a fact about his life that he never knew was revealed. What happened as a result of the Boston revelations was that the New Hampshire Attorney General investigated the Diocese of Manchester, which is all of New Hampshire, and issued a report and issued an 8,600-page archive along with it. And Bishop Accountability published that archive online. That was the first archive of the kind that you're now getting in much larger form here in Santa Fe. Others followed. Here we see an enormous press conference with a lawyer, Ray Boucher, out in Los Angeles, announcing a settlement that was going to release the Los Angeles archive. The survivors from Chicago with Jeff Anderson towards the front, Mark Perlman on the left, releasing a Chicago archive. So as a result of Boston, archives began to come out, and because there were PDFs, we could all get at them, we could all read them. These archives are available online for you. But in 2018, another phase happened, because Cardinal McCarrick, probably most of you, one of the most important and most powerful prelates in the Catholic Church, was exposed by the gentleman on the right, James Bryan, as a serial offender. For someone that high to have been ultimately defrocked, I think really shook the Catholic Church in the United States. This is a person who had buried Ted Kennedy, and suddenly he was persona non grata. Another thing that happened in 2018 was that a report was issued about 6 dioceses in Pennsylvania. And it was released, as you see, with the Attorney General in the middle and some of the survivors who had contributed to the report, their testimony, standing around him and supporting him. This had an incredibly shocking effect in the United States, and other attorneys general, as a result, did their own investigations and published their own reports. These things covered multiple dioceses. So we had a view not just of LA or Chicago, but of all of Pennsylvania or all of Colorado. And there was a sense, I think, as a result, that this was more serious and broader in scope. The fifth phase, I really do think, is this Santa Fe archive. And the reason I say that is that right now in the Catholic Church, the Church is taking refuge in bankruptcy as a way of defending itself. And what attorneys like the amazing Levi to my left are doing in response is finding ways of making that very corporate system accountable. One of the ways is to have survivor impact hearings where survivors get a chance to tell the judge what happened to them. It's not a matter of widgets, it's a matter of being a little child who is harmed. Another way that they can make this bankruptcy process better is by releasing documents. And this is quite a release. You look at the other bankruptcies that have released documents. 4,000 pages in Portland, 41 priests. 4,000 pages in Milwaukee, 41 priests. Wilmington began to break the mold. 27,000 pages, 20 priests. Now in Santa Fe, we're at 24,000 pages on 68 priests, priest files, and also depositions, and we have a lot more to go. The materials that are coming from Levi and his colleagues haven't even shown up online yet. They're there, and Portia and Avi are working on them. This is going to be one of the largest, if not the largest, single archives in the Catholic Church having to do with clergy abuse. It's a major, major development, and it puts in the shade a lot of what I've been talking about since. How did it happen? A survivor asked Bishop Wester, Archbishop Wester, in a meeting, will you release documents? I think the survivor and Levi had talked before and really planned this moment, and Wester said yes. It is an amazing thing that the Catholic Church has said yes to being transparent about these things, and this is first. I don't think it's a last. A little bit about the importance, and I'll shut up. I'm sorry I've gone long. The size and complexity of this archive make it different. It reveals the way priests networked with each other to abuse children, and that is a horrible fact and an important fact. I'm very, very new to this place, to this amazing place, but this is an amazing cultural spot in the country. And to see how clergy abuse worked to abuse children in this place of many cultures is going to be really valuable. As Pat mentioned, an attorney named Pasternak was at this many, many years ago, so there's legal history here. And there's geographic reach because the servants of the Paraclete brought priests in from all over the country and even the world. Someone here is writing a book about that right now. The servants are a very, very important part about the crisis, and we're going to learn a lot more about them because of this archive. The connections it makes. So you can have depositions about a priest and also have a personnel file of that priest. You combine these two sources and you begin to learn much more than either one of those sources would be able to tell you. You can relate this archive to other sources. So Levi, Brad Hall, and his colleagues put out some documents back, I believe, in 2017 on 3 of the priests that are represented in this archive. They show things that the Santa Fe archive doesn't show. So the archives begin to talk with each other. The archives have connections that really create meaning. And scholars are getting into the act, as they didn't for a long time. It used to be this was the province of reporters alone. And now this project that Katie and I were involved in at Notre Dame brought a bunch of scholars together to pore over the documents and write books and articles about them. And that's, I think, going to mean a sea change in the way everyone understands the crisis. Now, this is also an example, because there are other bankruptcies coming down the pike, and I know for a fact that some of them are going to result in archives going to other institutions of higher learning, like has happened here at Santa Fe. So Santa Fe is a leader in a very, very new development in the Catholic clergy abuse crisis. Thanks.
Thank you all for being here. I want to start my talk with a very short disclaimer. I was raised Catholic. I have a lot of deeply Catholic people in my life who I deeply love and deeply respect. And some of the things I may say in this portion of the panel talk may sound a little bit harsh. I know there's a lot more nuance to these things than maybe my remarks here might reflect, but I'm going to give them anyway, and I stand by them. I think that what I want to talk about in terms of the significance of this archive, others that have come before it, and others that will come after it, is power, essentially. And I come at this from the perspective of a lawyer, and a lawyer in a field of law that is pretty much the most, adversarial and contentious field of law you can get into. So I look at these things through the lens of conflict ultimately, and I was trained to see the law as an arena of conflict. Within that arena, in this context and in every other context, there's a battle for the mantle of truth-telling. The law and its mechanisms, its procedures, are all focused on figuring out which side is telling the truth. That's true in each case as a microcosm, but it's true here, in my opinion, as a macrocosm. It's a big picture point. There is a battle in this space over the truth-telling function. Any arena of conflict has its rules. In some, it's no eye gouging, no fish hooking, and et cetera, et cetera. But in the legal arena, there are rules as well. There are rules around, there are statutory rules, there are constitutional rules, there are procedural rules, there are evidentiary rules, and within the sort of framework that these rules provide, anything kind of goes. As long as you're within the parameters of the rules, there's a lot of tactical and strategic discretion to do what you need to do to pursue your objectives, win your argument and claim the mantle of truth-telling. One of those rules in the American legal framework is, no targeting an institution for its religious beliefs. No singling out an institution for its specific religious beliefs and saying that we're going to criminalize that or we're going to, expressly penalize that specific religious teaching. And the church, as a player in the arena of conflict over the years, is well aware of the rules. It has its own lawyers, and it leverages them. So secular society leverages these rules too, but once the church is in the arena of conflict, pulled into the legal system, it takes advantage of these rules to achieve its objectives. More power to it, that this is the system that we have, and that's the church's prerogative. The Catholic Church is obviously an incredibly powerful and important historical institution. And the church has been powerful enough historically to set itself in opposition, and sometimes very explicit opposition, to the prerogatives of civil authority, civil society, secular order, and has been very successful for a very long time in preserving its independence and power in that regard. It's its own sovereign entity on the global stage, has its own global leader, its own global empire historically, frankly. And that power that the church has possessed, that claim to the mantle of truth-telling, has held firm for centuries, at very least, 1,000 years. The tug and pull between sources of secular authority and power and the church as a source of religious authority and power has played out over that time period, and has been a sort of a common thread. This tension between those two poles of power has been a bright, shining thread through the history of Europe, the old world, and into what we call the New World as well. The point I'm making here is that power that is held for all those centuries has begun in a very recent historical moment to show some real cracks. That the truth-telling mantle that I keep talking about is potentially on the cusp of changing hands in a very meaningful way, and archives, like the ones that we're talking about here today, are playing a very, very important role in that. The Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that we've seen are playing a very important role in that. The investigation by the Pennsylvania grand jury, the Attorney General's office, plays a very important role in that. We see this in, there were commissions in Ireland, there were commissions in Australia. There have been commissions in other countries as well. And then you see these archives like the ones that Terry was describing in Manchester, in Chicago, production of documents in Los Angeles. Here now in the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, the next archive perhaps in the Diocese of New Orleans, and then the next one, and the next one. And this is over a 20-year period. This is a period of time that's a blip on the historical radar for an institution like the Catholic Church that thinks of itself in centuries. So this, when we look at what is changing and how this sort of pull towards a more secular and democratic truth-telling function seems to be unfolding over the last 20 years, we see a trend. And to be frank, the power of the Catholic Church in a country like Ireland, which is a deeply, deeply Catholic country historically, I'm from an Irish Catholic family from Philadelphia, has waned to an incredible degree by the simple fact that the people in that society have learned the truth about what their bishops knew, when they knew it, and what they allowed to happen in order to prevent or avoid scandal. And they've drifted away because it's a betrayal, ultimately. The power of the Catholic Church in a country like Ireland, which was so strong for so long, is dissipated to a significant degree because people learned the truth through these commissions, through the review of documents. And so, we talk about this, it's a cliche, right? That knowledge is power. But it's a cliche because it's true. The church, the Catholic Church, has always known this. It's always known that knowledge is power, and it has always leveraged the reality that knowledge is power through the extensive and laudable education of its clergy, which facilitated a mentality of clericalism that placed those clergy on a higher plane than the laity and the people in their communities, through the sacrament of confession, which made priests the repositories of everyone's darkest secrets in a Catholic community. The church understands perhaps better than any historical institution that knowledge is power, and has used that for a very long time to preserve its status and authority. If knowledge is power, centralized knowledge is centralized power. Private knowledge is private power. The inverse is true as well. Public knowledge is public power. The knowledge of a community is the power of a community. And these archives and these commissions that seek to take what was, for a very long time, very confidential, very private, very restricted information, and turn it over to the people in society to make of what they will, is an effort to empower the laity, essentially, or the people in the community, at the expense, essentially, of the Catholic Church. And I think that the particular importance of archives like this one, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, like the ones we've seen in Ireland and Australia and Pennsylvania and elsewhere, is that they do give essentially seals of secular institutional authority to all of us. They give these insignias of authoritative truth-telling. It's easy, well, it's not easy, it's very hard for just a private citizen or a group of private citizens to get traction in a broader community, but logistically, but also because human beings gravitate to authoritative sources, or what they perceive to be authoritative sources. And this development over the past 20 years in secular civil institutions coming into this arena, exerting their own power to take information that was once very private and restricted and distribute it to the public, does give real legitimacy to the contents of what the archive, to what the archive includes. This is not just the opinions or theorizing of a private citizen. This is these secular civil institutions, and we believe in the truth and authenticity of these materials enough to put our seal of approval on them and to hand them over to you as something that is legitimate and something for you all to consider. And I think that's a very powerful thing, and I think we're going to continue to see it play out in the years to come. But this tug and pull over the truth-telling mantle is not done by a long shot, not even here in the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. The Archdiocese, for all that it's produced and what it has produced to its credit, and to Archbishop Wester's great credit in volunteering, essentially, or agreeing to produce materials when questioned as to whether he would produce them, for all of those disclaimers. The Archdiocese is still withholding a great deal of information. The personnel files of 60 plus priests who were accused in the bankruptcy proceedings as having been involved in the sexual abuse of children. The Archdiocese refuses to produce these materials because it says that it does not deem these priests, by its own internal metrics, to be credibly accused. And the agreement that forms the basis of this archive says nothing about credibly accused, to be perfectly clear. The definition of abuse documents in this agreement, this memorandum, talks about accused, right? The documents are abuse documents under this archival agreement if they touch on a priest who is accused of childhood sexual abuse. And the word credibly has nothing to do with it. But within the arena of legal conflict, the Archdiocese sees an opportunity to say, well, we think we have a legal argument for interpreting this in a particular way, and it's a particular way that keeps more of that information behind closed doors, puts less of that information into the public domain, and that's the legal argument that we're going to stand on until, through this process that I've been talking about, someone challenges them on it, right? And so that's, again, just bringing us back from the big picture of, I think, what this historical significance of these archives means to me, back to the reality that every inch that's gained in a conflict like this is hard fought. It has to be. And it's not, as I think all of these panelists have pointed out, just the function of lawyers, just the function of journalists, just the function of researchers or anything else. It becomes the function of a societal call for information that they're legitimate, that the people in a community are legitimately entitled to, in my estimation. Just as a quick closing anecdote, maybe antidote. I spent 10 years, periodically having phone calls with people who were calling me survivors, frequently, or their family members calling me and asking, for information about a priest, information about a bishop, information about a parish that I couldn't give them because it was bound up in confidentiality orders or because it had never been produced to me in the first place. And I had to have these conversations with many, many survivors where it's like, even if I did have the information, I'm very sorry, I can't give that to you. That was a brutal thing to tell abuse survivors when they're just looking for the truth about the person who abused them, looking to figure out the truth about this enormous, meaningful event in their lives. And since the creation of this archive, since these documents became publicly accessible, I've had a number of conversations where someone calls looking for information, and I can tell them, yes, actually I can give you that. Actually, you can learn about this person who abused you. Actually, you can take this and show all your family members who never believed you for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, that there's 10 letters in this priest personnel file, between him and the bishop talking about some sexual misconduct with a child that he was implicated in. And if they didn't believe you, and they said, you're making this up, put it on the table. You can show them, a source of information that they very likely, if deem authoritative. that's empowerment. I mean, that's the empowerment of survivors and the empowerment of people in a community above and beyond the institutional power of the Catholic Church. And that is ultimately the most salient and long-lasting significance that I see in these archives. And these battles now, I mean, there's enough of a trend now that these battles are going to be fought. You know, Terry pointed out a moment ago that from a legal strategic standpoint, the Catholic Church and its dioceses are availing themselves frequently of the bankruptcy system as a means of putting distance between their resources and juries, frankly, but trying to handle, you know, the claims of survivors in one procedural setting that's favorable to them in many ways, but they do, you know, the bankruptcy system does provide this forum now, and there's enough precedent in support of this maneuver for survivors now to demand from the beginning that there will be an archive, right? At the end of this bankruptcy, if we are going to reach an agreement that allows you to resolve your legal liabilities, there will be an archive. Your priest personnel files will go into that archive, and that archive will be available to the people of this community, because they deserve it. They deserve to know what the church did. And so I think that, you know, in our work, we have stood on the shoulders of giants in many ways, and, you know, at a time where the records of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe were something of a black box, you know, where we could ask the diocese or even legally compel the diocese to produce certain information about abusive priests over the course of the past 50 years. We would get some information, but we never know, you know, what was withheld, really. The diocese can tell us, or its lawyers can tell us, oh no, this is everything. We don't know. And the work that Terry and his team did at Bishop Accountability, and the work that Pat and many others have done over the years to create an actual publicly available set of materials that we can cross-reference was an incredibly powerful tool, because we could say, well, okay, you said this is everything you have. We just went to Bishop Accountability and Control F for, you know, Servants of the Paraclete, New Mexico, or Archdiocese of Santa Fe, Hannah Springs, or whatever, and we came up with a list of like 15 more people that, you know, we don't have personnel files for. So what gives, you know, because the judge told you to give us all of these, and then that would very frequently lead to new production. So these archives are incredibly important. The public domain and public access to this information is incredibly important for a lot of reasons. And ultimately, I see it as an important tool in the empowerment of the public in this space. So, thank you.